All right, well, welcome to our next video in this series called Understanding the Big Picture of the Bible. What we're going to be talking about in this video is the composition of the Bible. Or in other words, what's actually in the Bible. You know, even this is kind of a mystery for a lot of people, and maybe you flip it open and see all these various books and ideas, and again, it'd be a little bit confusing. So this video will just give you an overview of what's actually contained within the covers of the Bible. Well, what you discover is the Bible actually isn't one book. It's actually a compilation of 66 different books that make up the Old and the New Testament. In the Old Testament, there are 39 different books, and in the New Testament, there are 27 different books. So when you open up to the beginning of the Bible, you may have a table of contents that looks something like this, listing out all the different books in both the Old and the New Testament. In the Old Testament, you start with Genesis and go all the way through Malachi, and then in the New Testament, you start with Matthew and go all the way through Revelation. Now, when you look at this word testament, you have Old Testament and New Testament. That can be confusing sometimes. But really, the word testament is just another word for covenant. Again, a covenant is like an agreement between two parties. And in the Old Testament, what we have is a description of God's covenant with humanity that is really based on law. And then in the New Testament, you have a description of God's covenant with humanity that is based not on law, but on grace. So let's look at these two testaments now. First, in the Old Testament. The Old Testament was written between about 1400 BC and 400 BC. So it was written over about a 1,000-year period. And it was written primarily in the Hebrew language. And what the Old Testament does is it describes the beginnings of the world, how this all came to be, and then how God deals with humanity, primarily through what we see him dealing with and through the nation of Israel. And what we discover is that as God deals with Israel, that the covenant that God has with Israel is really based on their obedience to his law that he gave them. So throughout the Old Testament, we see this relationship between God and this nation of Israel and how his covenant was played out through obedience, their obedience to his law. Well, when you come to the New Testament, it's a little bit different. The New Testament was written between 50 and 95 AD. So you see that the New Testament was written over a much shorter period of time, only about less than 50 years or so. And it was written primarily in the Greek language. And what the New Testament describes is how Jesus Christ comes to the world. Jesus Christ was not just a man, he was God in the flesh. We'll see that more later. But it describes the story of how God came to the world in the person of Jesus Christ, and what he did was he brought a new way for humanity to relate to God. And this new way wasn't just for one particular nation like we see in the Old Testament. This was a new way for all people to relate to God. And what we see described in the New Testament is what Jesus brings is this new covenant with God. And it's a covenant that is not based on our obedience to a law, but it is based on our acceptance of God's grace. And so we see this whole new way of relating to God. So why don't you go ahead and pause for a minute now that you've got the big picture of the Bible here, and discuss these questions.